a little girl approached a millionaire on the street, saying, "My mom knows you." When he finally laid eyes on the girl's mother, his face went pale. Matthew Johnson, a 45-year-old millionaire businessman, walks through the bustling streets of New York City, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The chaos of the city, with its flashing neon signs and the constant hum of traffic, barely registers in his mind. His thoughts are consumed by his next meetings, the endless chase for higher profits, and the strategic moves that keep his tech empire thriving. Despite the wealth and power he's amassed, there's a weight in his chest he can't quite identify, a restlessness that grows with each step he takes. It's a feeling that all the success and luxury in the world can't seem to satisfy. As Matthew weaves through the crowded sidewalks, his gaze remains fixed straight ahead, avoiding the faces that blur past him. He's built a life that others envy, penthouse views, exclusive clubs, and a reputation as one of the most influential men in the industry. But the silence of his penthouse at night and the empty echo of his own footsteps remind him of the solitude he carries. He repeats the same words to himself, like a mantra: focus, profit, success. Yet, a nagging thought lingers at the back of his mind, whispering that something essential is missing. The city that once felt like a conquest now seems like a maze he can't escape. Passing by street vendors and families enjoying a chilly autumn day, Matthew finds himself glancing at their carefree interactions. He quickly dismisses it, telling himself that emotions are distractions, a lesson he learned early in his career. But deep down, a question lingers: why isn't this enough? He shakes off the thought, tightening his grip on his leather briefcase, determined to keep moving forward. For now, he remains a solitary figure in a crowded city, unaware that his tightly controlled life is on the brink of an unexpected turn, one that will force him to confront the choices he made and the emptiness he tried to ignore. As Matthew walks through the crowded streets, his mind is suddenly pulled back into the present by a small voice. "Hey, mister." He turns to see a young girl, her clothes worn and her hair a little tangled. She looks up at him with wide eyes, a hint of determination in her expression. "My mom knows you," she says, her voice barely loud enough to rise above the city's noise. Matthew, used to people approaching him for money or favors, instinctively waves her off, ready to keep moving. But something in her tone makes him hesitate. He glances back, meeting her gaze, and there's a sincerity there that he can't ignore. "Look, I don't have time for games," Matthew replies, his voice brusque as he adjusts his tie. But the girl stands her ground, her hands clutching the straps of her worn backpack. "Her name is Alice. She told me about you," she insists, a spark of hope flickering in her eyes. Matthew's heart skips a beat at the mention of the name. Alice, memories he thought he had buried long ago come rushing back, tugging at something deep inside him. He feels a knot tighten in his chest, but he quickly tries to brush it off, convinced that it must be some mistake or coincidence. As the girl continues to look at him expectantly, Matthew feels an unfamiliar urge to ask more. He can't pinpoint why, but he suddenly wants to know who this girl is and what she means by her claim. "All right, kid," he sighs, trying to maintain his composed demeanor. "Why don't you tell me what this is about?" The girl's face lights up with relief, as if she's been waiting for him to say those words. "Come with me, and I'll show you," she says eagerly, taking a few steps forward, expecting him to follow. Against his better judgment, Matthew finds himself trailing behind her, his mind racing with questions. They weave through the side streets, away from the busy avenues, and Matthew becomes increasingly aware of the unfamiliar path he's treading. The further they walk, the more his thoughts drift back to the name that has haunted him for years. He remembers Alice's laughter, her smile, things he had forced himself to forget when he chose his career over their future together. The young girl keeps glancing back to make sure he's following, her pace quick but steady. Matthew wonders what kind of life Alice has now, why she never reached out, and how she ended up connected to this child who speaks of her with such familiarity. As they approach a small square tucked away from the city's chaos, Matthew's curiosity shifts into something deeper, a sense of dread mixed with hope. He's not sure if he's ready to confront whatever awaits him at the end of this walk, but he knows that he can't turn back now. The girl stops in front of a small stall where fresh roses are displayed in simple buckets, their fragrance subtly filling the air. "She's right there," she says softly, pointing to a woman kneeling by the flowers, carefully arranging them. For a moment, Matthew's breath catches in his throat. He recognizes the curve of her shoulders, the gentle way she handles the delicate roses. It's Alice. And in that instant, the life he's built begins to feel like a fragile illusion, ready to shatter at any moment. Mia tugs at Matthew's sleeve, urging him closer to the small stall where Alice arranges her roses. Her hands move with a practiced grace, selecting each stem with care. Matthew freezes for a moment, caught between a flood of memories and the reality in front of him. Alice, the woman he thought he had left behind in his past, is now right there, surrounded by the vivid colors of the roses she sells. She looks up briefly, catching a glimpse of him, and her expression shifts from calm to shock. The rose in her hand slips from her grasp, landing softly on the ground. Matthew swallows hard, struggling to maintain his composure as Alice stands up, brushing off her apron. For a moment, they simply stare at each other, the noise of the city fading into the background. "Matthew," she says, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she's seeing a ghost. Mia glances between the two of them, sensing the tension but unsure of its source. Matthew finally finds his voice, though it comes out more uncertain than he intended. "Alice, it's been a long time." The air between them feels heavy, weighed down by a decade of unspoken words and regrets. Alice's gaze shifts to Mia, who is clinging to Matthew's side, then back to him. "Why are you here?" she asks, her tone carrying both curiosity and a hint of defensiveness. Matthew hesitates, his mind racing with explanations that feel inadequate. He wasn't prepared for this, to see the woman he had abandoned so many years ago, now struggling to make a living in the shadow of the city's towering skyscrapers. "I didn't know," he stammers, his eyes dropping to the roses scattered at her feet. But Alice doesn't press him further. Instead, she picks up the fallen rose, her fingers trembling slightly. Mia steps closer to Alice, breaking the silence with her youthful innocence. "I told him, Mom. I told him you knew him," she says with a small smile, as if expecting this reunion to bring joy. Alice forces a smile in return, though the pain lingers in her eyes. Matthew watches as Alice's expression softens when she looks at Mia, and he can't help but wonder what kind of life they've had together, what hardships they've faced since he left. A sense of guilt creeps up on him, realizing that while he was building his empire, Alice and Mia were struggling to survive. With the tension hanging heavily between them, Matthew knows he can't walk away this time. The weight of the past presses down on him, demanding acknowledgement. "Alice, I never meant for things to end like that," he begins, his voice faltering as he sees her flinch at his words. She shakes her head, as if refusing to revisit old wounds. "We can't change the past, Matthew," she replies, focusing her attention back on the roses, as if they hold all the answers she needs. But despite her words, the past is right there, staring back at both of them, begging to be confronted. Matthew and Alice stand there in the middle of the bustling square, surrounded by the fragrance of roses and the distant hum of city life. The weight of their history fills the space between them, making every word feel like a struggle. Matthew clears his throat, trying to find the right words. "Alice, I didn't know things had turned out this way for you," he says, glancing around at her modest setup. But Alice's eyes flash with a mixture of frustration and hurt. "You didn't know because you never bothered to find out," she retorts, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from his sudden concern. Alice takes a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she rearranges the flowers in the buckets, more for distraction than necessity. "You left, Matthew. You walked away without a second thought, and I had to pick up the pieces," she continues, her voice breaking slightly as she fights to keep her composure. Matthew feels a pang of guilt twist inside him. He wants to defend himself, to say that he had his reasons, that he thought he was doing what was best. But looking at Alice now, he realizes how hollow those justifications sound. I thought you'd be better off without me," he admits quietly. Alice lets out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Better off," she echoes, her voice laced with disbelief. "I had to raise Mia on my own, working jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. And you," she pauses, gesturing towards him with a weary wave of her hand, "you became the great Matthew Johnson, the one who has everything. Meanwhile, we were just trying to make it through each day." Her words cut through him like a knife, each one landing with a force he hadn't expected. Matthew looks down, the weight of his own choices pressing down on him like never before. For a moment, Matthew considers walking away, retreating back into the safe distance he's always maintained. But then he catches a glimpse of Mia, who watches their exchange with wide, curious eyes. There's a part of him that wonders if it's too late to make things right, if he's even capable of fixing the damage he's done. "I want to help, Alice," he says, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Let me do something for you and Mia, anything to make up for," but Alice interrupts him, shaking her head firmly. "We don't need your charity, Matthew. We've gotten by without you for this long. We'll keep doing it." Matthew feels the sting of her rejection, but he knows deep down that she's right. He's the one who left, the one who chose a life where they didn't belong. Yet, standing here now, he's not sure he can go back to that life without trying to change things. "Maybe you don't need me, Alice," he says, his voice softer, almost pleading. "But I think I need this, need to make amends. Even if you don't want my help, let me try." Alice hesitates, the resolve in her eyes wavering for just a moment, but she doesn't respond. She simply turns back to her roses, leaving Matthew to grapple with the uncertain path that lies ahead. Despite the tension hanging in the air, Matthew finds himself unable to walk away. He watches as Alice continues to arrange her roses, trying to ignore his presence. He knows that if he leaves now, he'll never get another chance to set things right. Taking a deep breath, he steps closer, his voice softer than before. "Let me at least take you and Mia somewhere safe," he offers, glancing towards Mia, who stands by quietly, holding a single rose in her small hands. "You don't have to accept anything else from me, but I can't stand the thought of leaving you here, exposed to whatever dangers this city holds." Alice looks up at him, searching his face for a sign of sincerity. There's a flicker of vulnerability in her expression, one she quickly tries to mask. "Why do you care now, Matthew?" she asks, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't care 10 years ago." Her words are sharp, but there's a crack in her resolve, a hint of exhaustion that he notices for the first time. Matthew hesitates, unsure of how to respond. "Because I've made too many mistakes, and I can't live with making another one," he admits, the weight of those words surprising even him. For a moment, there's silence, as if the world around them has paused, waiting for her answer. Alice finally looks down, her fingers brushing over the petals of a rose, as if gathering strength. She glances at Mia, who looks up at her mother with a hopeful expression. Alice's shoulders sag, a heavy sigh escaping her lips. "Fine," she says reluctantly, though her tone lacks the conviction she usually has. "But only because of Mia. She deserves better than this." Matthew nods, feeling a small spark of relief despite the harshness of her words. He gestures towards a nearby diner, a small, unassuming place where they could at least sit down and talk away from the cold. "Let's go inside, get something warm," he suggests, trying to keep his tone casual, even as his heart pounds with the uncertainty of what comes next. As they walk toward the diner, Matthew watches Alice and Mia out of the corner of his eye. The years have clearly taken their toll on Alice, but there's a resilience in her steps, a strength he always admired, even if he never knew how to support it. Mia chatters softly beside her mother, clutching her rose like a prized possession. Matthew realizes that he's stepping into a new world, one where the rules are different from the boardrooms and business deals he's so used to. Here, it's not about power or status, it's about the lives he left behind, the connections he broke. They reach the entrance of the diner, and Matthew holds the door open for Alice and Mia. He catches Alice's glance, noticing the uncertainty that lingers in her eyes as she steps inside. It's a simple gesture, but it feels monumental, like a small crack in the wall she's built between them. As they settle into a booth, Matthew's mind races with possibilities. He doesn't know what will come of this, whether Alice will ever trust him again or if he'll truly be able to help. But he's made a choice, one that pulls him out of the safety of his carefully controlled life and into a world where the stakes are far more personal. As the days pass, Matthew becomes more involved in Alice and Mia's lives. He arranges for them to stay in a small but cozy apartment in a safer neighborhood, far from the busy streets where Alice used to sell her roses. Alice is hesitant to accept his help, but the relief of having a stable place for Mia is undeniable. Matthew visits often, bringing groceries and helping with little things around the apartment. Despite the growing familiarity, a shadow looms over their fragile new beginning. Chase, Alice's current boyfriend, who has a reputation for being volatile and unpredictable. One evening, Matthew arrives at the apartment to find Alice with a bruise on her arm, half hidden beneath her sweater. He stops in the doorway, his heart sinking at the sight. "Alice, what happened?" he asks, his voice low, but she quickly pulls her sleeve down, looking away. "It's nothing, Matthew. You don't need to worry about it," she says, forcing a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. But Matthew knows the truth, and it sends a wave of anger through him. "Is it Chase?" he presses, his jaw clenched. Alice's silence is all the confirmation he needs, and it's enough to push him to the edge. The next day, Matthew starts making discreet calls, using his influence to find out more about Chase's background. He learns that Chase has been involved in some dangerous activities, making him even more of a threat to Alice and Mia's safety. But Matthew is careful not to let Alice know what he's up to. He's determined to handle the situation without scaring her or making her feel like he's trying to control her life again. His priority becomes clear: he needs to protect them from Chase, even if it means getting his hands dirty. As tension grows between Matthew and Chase, their paths inevitably cross. One afternoon, Chase shows up at Alice's door while Matthew is visiting. He eyes Matthew with barely concealed hostility, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "So, the rich guy thinks he can play hero now, huh?" Chase sneers, leaning casually against the doorframe. Matthew's fists clench at his sides, but he forces himself to stay calm, not wanting to escalate the situation in front of Mia, who watches from the hallway with wide eyes. "I'm just here to make sure they're safe," Matthew replies evenly, meeting Chase's gaze without flinching. Chase's expression hardens, and he steps closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "They're my family, not yours. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." The tension crackles in the air, but Matthew stands his ground, refusing to back down. It's a silent standoff that leaves Alice caught in the middle, torn between fear of Chase and the faint hope that Matthew can truly make a difference. As Chase leaves with a final warning glance, Matthew knows this is only the beginning of a dangerous game. He's now entangled in a struggle that is far more personal than any business deal he's ever faced, and the stakes have never been higher. With the immediate danger of Chase looming, Matthew tries to bring a sense of normalcy back into their lives. He spends more time with Alice and Mia, trying to create moments of happiness amidst the tension. On weekends, he takes them out for simple outings, visiting parks, exploring local markets, and even going to the movies, something Mia had rarely experienced before. These moments feel like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that life doesn't always have to be defined by fear. As they stroll through the park one sunny afternoon, Matthew finds himself smiling genuinely for the first time in years. Mia quickly grows attached to Matthew, seeing in him a warmth she hadn't known before. She clutches his hand as they walk, telling him stories about her school and the things she likes. "Do you know any good jokes?" she asks one day, her face lighting up with curiosity. Matthew thinks for a moment, then tells her a silly joke he remembers from his own childhood. Mia bursts out laughing, a sound so pure and joyful that even Alice, watching from a distance, can't help but smile. These small, fleeting moments begin to knit them closer together, forming bonds that feel strangely natural. Alice watches the two of them, torn between gratitude and a lingering wariness. She sees the way Matthew looks at Mia, with a protectiveness that is both tender and sincere. Part of her wants to believe that he has changed, that the man who left her all those years ago has finally learned what truly matters. Yet, there's a part of her that still fears this is all temporary, a brief respite before he inevitably returns to his world of high-rise offices and luxury. When Matthew catches her looking, she quickly averts her eyes, but he senses the questions she doesn't voice. One afternoon, they sit together on a bench by the river, the city skyline gleaming in the distance. Mia runs ahead, chasing after a flock of pigeons, her laughter echoing through the air. Matthew glances at Alice, his expression softening. "She's amazing, you know," he says, nodding towards Mia. Alice nods slowly, her guard slipping just a bit. "She's strong," she replies, her voice quiet but proud. "She had to be." They fall into a comfortable silence, the kind that wasn't possible between them before. It's a moment of understanding, unspoken but deeply felt. As the sun sets, casting a warm glow over the city, Matthew realizes that these moments have become the highlight of his days. He feels something shift inside him, a sense of belonging that he hasn't felt in years. It's not about grand gestures or impressive achievements, it's about sitting beside Alice, listening to Mia's laughter, and feeling like he's part of something real. For the first time, Matthew wonders if this is what he's been searching for all along, hidden beneath the layers of wealth and success he thought would make him whole. One rainy afternoon, as Matthew, Alice, and Mia take shelter in the cozy warmth of the small apartment, Mia stumbles upon an old photo album tucked away on a dusty shelf. "Mom, look what I found," she exclaims, pulling it out and flipping through the worn pages. The album is filled with pictures from a time before Mia was born, photos of Alice smiling, carefree, and beside her is a much younger Matthew. Mia pauses on a particular photo of the two of them, standing close together with the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. She glances up, her brow furrowed in confusion. "You and Matthew knew each other back then?" Alice's breath catches as she looks at the photo, her hands trembling slightly as she takes it from Mia's grasp. Matthew watches the scene unfold, his heart sinking as he realizes what this moment means. Alice looks to him, then back at Mia, trying to find the right words. "Yes, we did," she says softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia looks between them, the gears in her mind turning as she tries to piece together the fragments of a story she never knew existed. "Were you friends?" she asks, her innocence cutting through the tension in the room. Alice closes the album, pressing her lips together as if trying to hold back a flood of emotions. "It's more complicated than that," she replies, finally meeting Matthew's gaze. He sees the pain and unresolved feelings in her eyes, and he knows this conversation is long overdue. "I was someone important to your mom once," Matthew says, choosing his words carefully as he addresses Mia. "But I made some mistakes, and I left when I shouldn't have." His voice is tinged with regret, and he can see the impact his words have on both Alice and Mia. The air between them is thick with unspoken truths. Mia looks up at Matthew, a mix of curiosity and sadness in her expression. "Why did you leave, Matthew?" she asks, her voice small. Matthew hesitates, struggling to find an answer that would make sense to a child. "I thought I was doing the right thing back then, but I was wrong," he says honestly, glancing over at Alice, who listens quietly, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes, grown-ups make mistakes that they regret later." Mia nods slowly, absorbing his words in the way only a child can. But Matthew can see the shadow of doubt in her eyes, the realization that their connection is tied to a past she never knew existed. After Mia goes to bed that night, leaving the photo album on the table, Matthew and Alice sit in silence, the sound of the rain tapping against the window. Alice finally breaks the quiet, her voice barely a murmur. "I never thought I'd have to explain this to her." Matthew nods, his gaze fixed on the photo that brought everything to the surface. "Neither did I," he admits, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him. They sit together, the past no longer hidden but laid bare between them, a reminder of the choices that still haunt them both. And as the rain continues to fall outside, Matthew realizes that whatever comes next will define their future more than anything that has come before. The tension between Matthew and Chase continues to escalate as the threat he poses becomes more immediate. One evening, as Matthew arrives at the apartment, he finds Alice anxiously pacing near the window, her face pale with worry. "He was here again," she mutters, glancing toward the door as if expecting Chase to return any moment. Matthew's jaw tightens, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Did he hurt you?" he asks, his voice barely restrained. Alice shakes her head but wrings her hands nervously. "Not this time. But he made it clear that he doesn't want you around, Matthew. He thinks you're trying to take Mia away from him." Matthew steps closer, his expression darkening. "He's dangerous, Alice. We can't just hope he'll go away on his own." He clenches his fists, feeling the urge to protect them both rise like a storm inside him. Alice looks torn, caught between fear of Chase's retaliation and the growing trust she's started to place in Matthew. "I know you want to help," she says, her voice cracking with emotion, "but I don't want Mia to be in the middle of all this. She's already seen too much." Matthew nods, understanding the weight of her words, but he knows that backing down now would only give Chase more power. The situation takes a darker turn when Matthew receives a threatening message late one night. A crumpled note is left on the windshield of his car, written in messy, scrawled letters, "Stay away, or else." He stares at the note, his hands trembling with a mix of fear and rage. It's a reminder that Chase is willing to cross any line to keep his hold over Alice and Mia. Matthew takes the note to Alice, who pales when she reads it. "He's getting more desperate," she says, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew nods, his resolve hardening. "We can't keep ignoring this, Alice. We need to take action before he does something we can't undo." Matthew contacts a private investigator, hoping to gather enough evidence to legally keep Chase away from Alice and Mia. But as the investigation unfolds, it only reveals more about Chase's involvement in illegal activities, connections that make him a dangerous man to cross. The more they learn, the more Alice's fear grows. "What if he finds out what you're doing?" she asks one night, her voice shaking with worry. Matthew places a hand on her shoulder, trying to reassure her despite his own uncertainty. "I'm not afraid of him, Alice. I'm afraid of what he'll do to you and Mia if we don't stop him." The tension reaches a boiling point when Chase confronts Matthew outside the apartment building one evening. With a sneer on his face, Chase steps into Matthew's path, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" Chase taunts, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Matthew stands his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, a coward who hurts the people he claims to care about," he replies coldly. The confrontation feels like a tipping point, a moment where everything could either spiral out of control or finally start to change. And as Chase walks away, hurling one last threat over his shoulder, Matthew knows that time is running out for him to make things right. One evening, as Matthew returns to the apartment building after a long day, he finds the front door slightly ajar. His heart races as he pushes it open, calling out for Alice and Mia. The living room is in disarray, with furniture overturned and the vase of roses shattered on the floor. panic surges through him as he rushes to find them. He hears Alice's voice, muffled and frantic, coming from the bedroom. When he bursts through the door, he finds her cornered, clutching Mia tightly in her arms, while Chase looms over them, his expression twisted with anger. Chase turns to face Matthew, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You just couldn't stay out of it, could you?" he sneers, stepping closer to Matthew. The tension crackles in the air, and Matthew knows that this is the moment everything has been building toward. He squares his shoulders, determined not to show any fear. "Get away from them, Chase," he says, his voice steady but cold. But Chase only laughs, a harsh, grating sound that fills the small space. "You think you can just come back into their lives and play the hero? You don't belong here." Without warning, Chase lunges at Matthew, knocking him to the ground. The two men struggle, grappling for control, but Chase has the upper hand. He pins Matthew down, landing a heavy blow to his face that sends pain shooting through his jaw. Matthew hears Alice's panicked cries as she tries to shield Mia from the violence unfolding before her eyes. Blood trickles from a cut on Matthew's lip, and for a moment, he feels the cold, crushing weight of failure. He had promised to protect them, and now, lying on the floor, he feels powerless to keep that promise. Chase finally releases him, shoving Matthew aside with a sneer of triumph. "See what happens when you try to be the good guy," he spits, casting a final, scornful glance at Alice and Mia. "This isn't over." With those parting words, he storms out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. Matthew pulls himself up, wincing at the pain coursing through his body. He sees the fear in Alice's eyes as she cradles Mia, who is trembling with silent tears. The sight of their terror cuts deeper than any physical wound, filling Matthew with a sense of despair he hasn't felt in years. As the adrenaline fades, Matthew collapses onto the couch, burying his head in his hands. He has never felt more defeated, more aware of his own limitations. Alice approaches him slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's better if you don't come around anymore, Matthew. I can't risk Mia's safety." Her words pierce through him, each one a reminder of how badly he has failed. He looks up at her, his vision blurred by unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Alice," he chokes out, but he knows it's not enough. For the first time, he feels the full weight of his past mistakes, and the realization that he might lose them both for good. After that night, Matthew finds himself alone, wandering the empty streets of New York. The city, once a place where he felt powerful and in control, now feels foreign and cold. He returns to his penthouse, the silence pressing in around him. The familiar luxury that once brought him pride now seems hollow. Sitting by the window, he stares out at the skyline, his thoughts consumed by the memory of Alice's fear and Mia's tears. "What have I done?" he murmurs, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. Matthew's mind replays the events that led him here, the choices he made that hurt the people he cared about most. He thinks about how he once justified leaving Alice, telling himself he was doing what was best. But now, it's clear that those justifications were just excuses to avoid facing his fears. He clutches a photo of Mia that he saved from the chaos, feeling the sharp sting of regret. For the first time, he confronts the reality that all the success he chased can't erase the emptiness he feels now. Yet, in the midst of this despair, a new determination takes root. Matthew knows he can't change the past, but he refuses to be defined by it. He remembers Mia's innocent laughter, Alice's cautious smile, and realizes he can't walk away again. "I have to make this right," he tells himself, his voice breaking the silence of the room. With a renewed sense of purpose, he begins to make plans, using the resources he once devoted to building his empire to now protect those he cares about most. It's a different kind of fight, but one he knows he must face, even if it means risking everything. Determined to confront the danger head-on, Matthew reaches out to Nolan, an old friend and private investigator, hoping to find a way to keep Chase away from Alice and Mia for good. They meet in a quiet cafe, the the dim light casting shadows over their faces as Matthew explains the situation. Nolan listens carefully, nodding with a serious expression. "This guy, Chase, has a reputation," Nolan says, tapping his pen on a notebook. "But if he's involved in any illegal activities, we can use that against him. It's risky, Matthew, but it might be the best chance to get him out of their lives." Matthew nods, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knows he can't afford to fail this time. Over the next few days, Nolan works tirelessly, uncovering details about Chase's shady dealings, his involvement with underground gambling and some connections to petty crimes. With this information in hand, they contact the authorities, providing enough evidence to warrant an investigation. Matthew watches from the sidelines, a bundle of nerves and hope, as the police begin to take interest in Chase's activities. For the first time, he feels like they might have a chance to turn things around. But the process is slow, and the looming fear of Chase's reaction keeps the tension high. Meanwhile, Matthew continues to support Alice and Mia, but he's careful not to let them know the full extent of what he's planning. He helps Mia with her homework and shares quiet conversations with Alice in the evenings, both of them trying to find a sense of normalcy. Yet, beneath the surface, there's a current of anxiety that neither can ignore. One night, as they sit on the couch while Mia sleeps, Alice looks at Matthew with uncertainty. "Why are you doing all this, Matthew? After everything that's happened?" she asks softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He pauses, taking a deep breath. "Because I should have done it a long time ago," he replies, meeting her gaze with a sincerity that makes her heart ache. The turning point comes and the police finally pay a visit to Chase's apartment. Matthew and Nolan watch from a distance, their breaths held as officers enter the building. It's a tense moment, but they see Chase being led out in handcuffs, his face twisted with anger. Matthew exhales, a wave of relief washing over him. But he knows this isn't the end. Chase's arrest is just one part of the battle. He still needs to rebuild the trust he lost with Alice and find a way to help them heal from the trauma of the past months. With Chase out of the picture, Matthew returns to the apartment, unsure of how Alice will react to the news. When he tells her that Chase has been arrested, Alice's shoulders slump, and she lets out a shaky breath, a mixture of disbelief and relief in her expression. "I don't know how to thank you, Matthew," she says, her voice thick with emotion. Matthew shakes his head, reaching out to take her hand gently. "You don't have to thank me, Alice. I just want to make sure you and Mia are safe," he says. In that moment, they both understand that while the danger may be gone, the path to rebuilding their lives is just beginning. And for the first time, Matthew feels a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they can face it together. With Chase now behind bars, the atmosphere in the small apartment begins to change. There's a newfound sense of calm, a quiet that had been missing for so long. Matthew helps Alice and Mia settle into this new reality, doing his best to support them as they adjust. He spends evenings at the apartment, playing board games with Mia and sharing dinner with Alice, the three of them slowly finding a rhythm together. Matthew realizes that while he came into their lives to make up for the past, he's found something he never expected, a sense of belonging. The days no longer feel like a struggle but instead hold the promise of something better. Alice, though still cautious, starts to let her guard down. She watches the way Mia laughs around Matthew, the way her daughter's eyes light up when he's around, and she can't help but feel grateful. One evening, as they sit together after Mia has gone to bed, Alice turns to Matthew with a soft smile. "You've done more for us than I could have imagined," she admits, her voice carrying a hint of vulnerability. Matthew reaches for her hand, his expression serious but filled with warmth. "I'm not going anywhere this time, Alice. I want to be here, with both of you," he says, the words carrying a weight that she's longed to hear. They continue to rebuild their lives, one step at a time. Matthew uses his resources to help Alice start a small flower shop, a place where she can sell her roses without the hardships of the streets. It's a modest space, but it's filled with the scent of fresh blooms and the promise of a new beginning. Mia helps out after school, arranging flowers with a wide grin on her face. Matthew watches from the sidelines, proud of how far they've come. It's not just about the shop or the stability they've found, it's about the sense of home that he's rediscovered with them. Yet, despite the progress they've made, Matthew knows that his relationship with Alice is still fragile. The wounds of the past haven't disappeared overnight. One afternoon, as they close up the shop together, he turns to her, his expression earnest. "I know I hurt you, Alice. And I know it's going to take time for you to trust me completely," he says, his voice thick with emotion. Alice looks at him, her gaze steady, but there's a softness there that wasn't before. "I'm willing to try, Matthew. For Mia, and for us," she replies, offering him a small but genuine smile. It's not a promise, but it's a start. As the weeks pass, they continue to build this new life together. Matthew finds that the sense of emptiness that once haunted him has begun to fade, replaced by a quiet contentment. He spends afternoons helping at the shop, evenings sharing stories with Mia, and nights talking with Alice about everything they had once left unsaid. There are still challenges ahead, but for the first time, Matthew feels like he's exactly where he's meant to be. And as he watches Alice and Mia laugh together under the glow of the shop's warm lights, he knows that this second chance is the most valuable thing he's ever earned. With Chase out of their lives for good, Alice, Matthew, and Mia begin to settle into a sense of normalcy, though their journey has left its mark. Alice's flower shop slowly becomes a cherished part of the neighborhood, attracting regular customers who appreciate her carefully arranged roses and warm smile. Matthew continues to help behind the scenes, offering advice and using his connections to help the shop grow. But more importantly, he focuses on being present, attending Mia's school events, sharing dinners at the shop, and simply being there for the small, everyday moments that now mean everything to him. Alice remains cautious, but she's no longer carrying the weight of her past alone. She starts to see Matthew not just as the man who left, but as someone who has worked hard to become part of their lives again. They take things slowly, with shared conversations that stretch late into the night and small gestures that build trust over time. One evening, as they lock up the flower shop together, Alice reaches out to hold Matthew's hand, offering him a quiet smile that speaks volumes. It's not an easy road, but for the first time, she feels like they might have a future worth building together. Mia thrives in this new environment, her laughter filling the spaces that were once heavy with tension. She no longer fears the shadows in the hallway or the possibility of Chase's return. Instead, she spends her days helping at the shop, exploring the nearby parks with Matthew, and dreaming of the possibilities that lie ahead. The bond she shares with Matthew deepens, and she starts calling him Matt, a nickname that feels like a symbol of acceptance. And as the three of them walk home together one evening, hand in hand, Alice glances at Matthew, her heart lighter than it has been in years. She knows that while the past can't be changed, the future is theirs to shape. On a warm spring afternoon, Matthew, Alice, and Mia walk through a sun-dappled park, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. They follow a familiar path, one they had walked months ago, but everything feels different now, lighter, more hopeful. Mia skips ahead, her laughter echoing through the trees as she finds a spot beneath a large oak tree. Matthew and Alice follow, a comfortable silence between them, their hands brushing occasionally. They spread out a blanket, settling in for a simple picnic, enjoying the easy rhythm of being together. As they sit, Matthew watches Mia arrange the food with childish enthusiasm, and he can't help but smile. He glances over at Alice, who catches his eye with a warmth that makes his heart ache in a good way. Without a word, she reaches over and takes his hand, offering a small but sincere smile. It's a gesture that speaks of trust, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they've come. Matthew wraps his arm around her shoulders as they lean back, watching Mia play nearby, her joy a reminder of all they've built together. The sun begins to set, casting a golden light across the park, and the city's hum fades into the background. Mia drifts off to sleep on the blanket, her head resting on Matthew's lap. He glances at Alice, and they share a look that says more than words could. In this moment, under the shade of the oak tree, Matthew realizes that he has found a new kind of success, one rooted not in wealth, but in the love and connection he thought he had lost forever. And as the sky turns from gold to deep blue, he knows he's finally found a place where he belongs.